Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we are opening up a file that, I'll be honest, I thought I understood before we started looking at the source material.
It's one of those topics, isn't it?
It really is. We are looking at Nicaragua, specifically that really intense, explosive window between 1979 and 1990.
It's a period that usually gets reduced to a bumper sticker, a really simple, clean story.
Completely. I mean, if you grew up when I did, or even if you just studied history in school, the narrative is almost always this rigid Cold War template.
Oh, absolutely.
You've got the Sandinistas on one side, wearing the red and black, representing the East, Soviet expansion, communism.
Right. The bad guys, if you're in Washington.
And then you've got the Contras on the other side, representing the West, freedom fighters, Reagan's doctrine. It's a chessboard, good guys, bad guys, depending on which side of the aisle you sit on.
And that's exactly where the problem lies, that binary view. It's comfortable, it's easy to digest, but the sources we have today suggest it's almost entirely useless for understanding what actually happened to the human beings on the ground.
Useless is a strong word.
I stand by it, because when you treat a country like a chessboard, you assume the pieces are solid. You assume the state is a solid thing, the revolution is a solid thing.
Okay.
But the research stack you've pulled together paints a completely different picture. It calls the conflict a complex ecosystem undergoing an entropic transition.
Okay, let's pause on that. Entropic transition. That sounds like something out of a physics textbook, not a history book. We're talking about thermodynamics.
In a way, yes. I mean, it's a metaphor, obviously, but a powerful one. Entropy is a measure of disorder, right?
Right, chaos.
It's the tendency of a system to move from order to chaos. The argument here is that the Nicaraguan Revolution wasn't just a political change. It wasn't a simple swapping of leaders.
It was something deeper.
It was a systemic collapse, a moment where a structure that had been frozen in place for 40 years, the Somoza dictatorship, shattered. And what followed wasn't a neat replacement of one government with another. It was a release of massive chaotic energy.
So instead of a chess match, we should be picturing what?
An explosion.
A dam breaking.
An ecosystem in free fall. And that's our mission today. We're going to deconstruct that mainstream narrative using this systems theory approach.
Right.
We're going to see how divergent worldviews, what the sources call ontological visions, basically different realities, collided with each other. We're going to look at how the U.S. didn't just fight a war, but applied algorithmic destabilization to engineer chaos.
Algorithmic destabilization. I want to put a pin in that because when we get to the CI manual later, that term becomes terrifyingly literal. It's not just a fancy phrase.
Not at all. It's a playbook. And we're going to see how a revolution that started with the goal of liberation ended up trapping itself in a loop, a feedback loop of violence and decay.
It really is a loop, isn't it?
Yeah.
The source material lays it out so starkly. We start with a dynasty, go through a decade of fire, and potentially end up with another dynasty.
The irony is, it's brutal.
But before we get to the end, we have to start with the ghost that haunts this entire story. The man the revolution was named after, Augusto Cesar Sandino.
The icon, the silhouette you see on every wall in Managua, that famous hat.
Right. And if you look at the FSLN propaganda from the 80s, Sandino is presented as this proto-Marxist saint, the grandfather of the socialist revolution. He's the guy who fought the U.S. Marines in the 1920s and 30s.
And he did fight them. That part is absolutely true. Between 1927 and 1934, he led what the Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral called his little crazy army in the mountains of Las Segovias. He held off the most powerful military in the world.
Which is an incredible story in its own right.
A true David and Goliath situation.
But here's the thing that caught me off guard in the reading. The historical Sandino, the actual guy, his writings, his letters, wasn't a Marxist. In fact, he might have been the complete opposite of a materialist.
This is what we call archaeology of a myth. When you dig up the actual writings of Sandino, you don't find treatises on dialectical materialism or the means of production. You find Theosophy.
Theosophy. Okay, you have to break this down for me and for anyone listening, because when I hear Theosophy, I think of seances and Madame Blavatsky and people trying to talk to spirits in Victorian parlors.
And you're not far off. Sandino was a syncretic thinker. He was a sponge. He'd worked in Mexico during their revolution. He'd read anarchist texts, nationalist texts. But he blended all of it with a very specific brand of spiritualism he picked up from a group called the Magnetic Spiritual School of the Universal Commune.
The what? The Magnetic Spiritual School?
Yes, it's a mouthful. He believed in the magnetic spiritual destiny of the Latin American region. He wrote these manifestos that are just They're wild.
And what does that even mean, magnetic spiritual?
He wrote about the Indo-Hispanic race having a specific vibrational frequency. He believed in this cosmic energy, this magnetic fluid.
Fluid.
Yeah. He believed that the Colossus of the North, the United States, wasn't just an economic enemy, but a spiritual threat, a force of materialism that was disrupting the cosmic order of the Americas.
Wait, so he thought fighting the Marines was a form of spiritual warfare?
Literally. He wasn't just fighting for land or sovereignty in a political sense. He believed that by resisting the U.S., he was helping to generate this magnetic fluid that would unify the Latin American people and fulfill their spiritual destiny. It's esoteric stuff. It's about root races and cosmic evolution and a final judgment day. It's much closer to a New Age cult than it is to Marx or Lenin.
That is just mind-blowing. I mean, imagine a modern revolutionary movement based on vibrations. So how on earth do we get from cosmic vibrations to the Sandinista National Liberation Front of the 1960s, which was explicitly Marxist-Leninist?
You perform a semi out of recovery, or, to put it more bluntly, a rebranding, a very intentional, a very strategic rebranding.
Okay.
The FSLN was founded in 1961, years after Sandino was assassinated by the first Somoza. The founders, like Carlos Fonseca, were university students, intellectuals. They needed a symbol.
They couldn't choose Marx.
No, Marx is a German guy. He doesn't resonate in a Nicaraguan village. They needed a homegrown hero, a figure that could unite the peasantry and the intellectuals. Marxism was the tool, the method. But Sandino was the soul, the brand.
So they essentially hollowed him out.
They performed a kind of ideological taxidermy. They kept the hat, they kept the silhouette, they kept the fierce nationalism and the anti-imperialism. That was the skin.
But they scooped out the insides.
They stripped away the Theosophy, the magnetic fluids, and all the weird esoteric stuff. They turned a complex, deeply strange, spiritual human being into a flat, useful icon for a specific political project.
It's kind of brilliant in a cynical way. You take the local hero, remove the parts that don't fit your narrative, and fill in with your new ideology.
Every revolution does it. You need a myth to anchor the movement. The French have Marianne, the Americans have the Founding Fathers, the FSLN had their version of Sandino. But it's just crucial to remember that the root of this Sandino tree is much, much stranger than the fruit it eventually bore.
So the FSLN has their symbol. They have their ideology, more or less.
Yeah.
But a symbol isn't enough to overthrow a government. You need a reason for people to risk their lives. And that reason was the Somoza family.
The Somoza dynasty, 43 years of it.
Now, usually we just hear dictator. Somoza was a dictator. But the source material uses a hyphenated term that I think explains why it was so hard to dislodge them and why the collapse was so messy. State patrimony.
Right, state patrimony. It's a crucial distinction. In a normal authoritarian regime, you might have a dictator, but there's still a conceptual distinction between the government and the leader's bank account. There's a bureaucracy that functions. There are public goods, even if they're poorly managed.
They're not here.
In a state patrimony, that line is completely erased. The state is treated as the private property of the ruling family. The Somozas didn't just run Nicaragua, they owned it.
A source listed some examples that are just staggering.
They owned the airline. Lonica, they owned the main shipping lines. Memenek, they owned the cement factories, the slaughterhouses, the media, the best farmland. If it made money, they owned a piece of it or all of it.
And the army.
The National Guard.
The National Guard wasn't a national army. It was a private security firm. It was created by the U.S. Marines in the 30s, and its first leader was Anastasio Somoza Garcia. Its loyalty wasn't to the Constitution or the flag. It was to the Somoza family. It functioned like a mafia enforcement wing.
So it's basically a family LLC with a standing army.
Exactly. And for decades, this system worked. It was stable. The U.S. supported it because Somoza was our son of a bitch, as the famous, likely apocryphal quote goes. He was reliably anti-communist.
A stable system.
But systems like this, rigid, centralized, totally controlled, are incredibly brittle. They can't flex. They can't absorb shocks. And in 1972, the Earth moved.
The Managua earthquake.
December 23rd, 1972. This is the catalyst for entropy, the event that breaks the system's back. I think a lot of people know there was an earthquake. But reading the details, it sounds apocalyptic. A 6.2 on the Richter scale, but it was shallow. The center of Managua was just flattened. 10,000 people dead in minutes.
The city center was obliterated. 250,000 people were left homeless overnight. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions.
But the physical destruction wasn't what killed the regime.
No, it was the social shockwave. Because what happens when a disaster hits? Usually a government tries to help, or at least it puts on a show of helping. It's a moment of national unity, you know.
Right. We're all in this together.
But Somoza, the third Somoza, Anastasio Somoza de Belém,
Right.
he saw an opportunity.
An opportunity in the middle of that horror.
International aid started pouring in, millions of dollars from the U.S., from Europe, from everywhere. And Somoza channeled that money directly into his own companies. He owned the concrete companies, so he got the contracts to clear the rubble. He owned the construction companies that would get the contracts to rebuild.
That is breathtakingly greedy.
It gets worse. His National Guard, the people supposed to be maintaining order, began looting. They weren't digging people out of the rubble, they were stripping the stores. There are credible stories of Guard commanders selling donated blood plasma abroad.
Selling the blood of the victims.
Yes, it was a total moral collapse. And this is why it's the catalyst. Before 1972, the middle class, the businessmen, the moderate bourgeoisie, they tolerated Somoza. He was corrupt, sure, but business was good. Stability was good.
They had a deal. A devil's bargain.
Exactly. But after the earthquake, they realized, this man is not just a thief, he's a predator, a cancer. He would let us die in the rubble to make a profit.
He broke the social pact.
Completely. He alienated the only people keeping him in power besides the Guard. The private sector turned on him. The church turned on him, led by Archbishop Obando y Bravo. The earthquake didn't just knock down buildings, it knocked down the consensus that held the state patrimony together. It injected a massive dose of chaos into a system that couldn't handle it.
So you have a regime that is rotting from the inside. You have a population that is furious. This is the moment for the FSLN. But, and this is another thing the sources highlight that complicates the simple story, the FSLN wasn't this unified, well-oiled machine either.
Not even close. In fact, for a while, it looked like they were going to tear themselves apart before they even got a shot at Somoza.
This is where we get into the triad. The three tendencies.
It sounds like a sci-fi novel, doesn't it? The three tendencies.
It does. But it's fascinating organizational theory. By the mid-70s, the FSLN had split into three distinct factions that barely talked to each other. They had completely different, and I mean completely different ideas on how to win the war. Let's run through them, because the differences are stark. First, you have the GPP.
The Guerra Popular Prolongada, Prolonged Popular War. These were the hardliners, the Maoists, the true believers.
Mountain guys.
Yes. They were led by figures like Tomás Borges. They believed the revolution had to be built slowly, patiently in the mountains among the peasantry. They looked at Vietnam and China as the model.
Right.
You dig tunnels, you gain the trust of the farmers, you build a popular army from the ground up, and you fight a 20-year war if necessary. They were patient, ascetic, and very suspicious of city people and intellectuals.
Okay, so they're playing the long game. Then you have the second group, the proletarians, the TP.
The Tendencia Proletaria. These were the urban intellectuals, the orthodox Marxists. They were led by people like Jamie Wheelock.
And what was their theory?
They read Marx and Lenin, and they said, the mountains are a historical backwater. The revolution happens where the capital is. It happens in the factories. It happens with the urban working class, the proletariat.
So forget the farmers.
To them, the key was organizing strikes, building unions, infiltrating factories. They wanted to raise class consciousness. They thought all the guerrilla stuff in the mountains was romantic, but ultimately secondary to the real class struggle in the cities.
So you have the mountain Maoists versus the city intellectuals. They must have hated each other.
They viewed each other with total contempt. And then the third group emerges, the Terceristas.
The third way. This is where the Ortega brothers, Daniel and Humberto, come in.
Right. And this is the group that ultimately wins the internal argument. They were the pragmatists.
The source calls them undogmatic, which is a polite way of saying they didn't care about the theory as much as the result.
That's a great way to put it. They looked at the other two groups and said, you're both wrong. We can't wait 20 years in the mountains like the GPP. Somoza will kill us all. And we can't wait for the workers to read Das Kapital like the TP. That will never happen.
They wanted action now.
They wanted a broad, popular insurrection. And crucially, they were willing to talk to anyone. This was their genius. They courted the business leaders who were mad about the earthquake. They courted the Catholic priests practicing liberation theology. They courted the international media.
So they weren't ideological purists.
Not at all. Their message was simple. We don't care if you're a Marxist. We don't care if you're a capitalist. If you hate Somoza, you are with us. They wanted to build a huge anti-Somoza front.
This seems to be the key to their success. The source mentions a concept, The theory of minimum resource.
Exactly. It's a psychological principle. None of these factions had the resources, the guns, the money, the people, to win alone. The GPP had the terrain and the military discipline. The proletarians had the urban network. The terceristas had the political strategy and the international connections.
They needed each other.
They realized that if they fought each other, Somoza wins. So in 1977, they unified. They created a superordinate identity. They decided that the brand FSLN was bigger and more important than their specific flavor of ideology.
And the terceristas proved their strategy was the right one with one of the wildest events in the whole war, the assault on the National Palace in 1978.
August 1978, Operation Chanchera. This is straight out of an action movie. It's the event that shatters the illusion of Somoza's power.
Walk us through it, because this wasn't a standard guerrilla ambush in the jungle.
No, this was pure political theater. A group of 25 tercerista commandos, led by the charismatic Eden Pastor Comandante Cerro, dressed up as the elite National Guard. They even had a name for the unit they were impersonating, the Pig Commandos.
Did they put on costumes?
They put on the enemy's uniform, and they marched right into the National Palace in broad daylight while the Nicaraguan Congress was in session.
They just walked in. No one stopped them.
They walked in, barked orders, and the real guards saluted them because they looked exactly like the elite unit. They took the entire Congress hostage. We're talking 2,000 people. Somoza's cousin, the Minister of the Interior, everyone.
That's insane.
For 2 days, the whole world watched. Somoza was cornered. He couldn't storm the palace without killing his own government.
So he had to fold.
He had to humiliate himself on the world stage. He paid a $500,000 ransom. He released 50 high-profile Sandinista prisoners from jail, including Tomas Bori, and he had to broadcast the FSLN's communique on the radio.
And the commandos.
He let them fly to Panama and Cuba. The photos of the guerrillas waving their rifles from the bus on the way to the airport. That was the end of the fear. It was a massive psychological victory.
That's the moment the entropy becomes irreversible. If a bunch of kids can walk into your palace, take the entire government hostage, and get away with it, the dictator has no clothes.
Precisely. It showed that the state patrimony was a hollow shell, and it forced the regime into a hyper-violent overreaction. Somoza started ordering the National Guard to bomb its own cities to try and crush the insurrection that followed, which just pushed everyone into the arms of the Sandinistas.
So fast forward a bit, the final offensive begins. By July 1979, the Guard has collapsed. Somoza flees. He literally tacks up the national treasury. They say he used coffins filled with cash and gold and flies to Miami. The Sandinistas roll into Managua. The revolution has won.
And this is where the movie usually ends, right? The credits roll. The good guys won. The people are cheering in the streets.
But in a complex ecosystem, removing the apex predator Somoza doesn't restore balance. It creates a vacuum.
A huge vacuum. And into that vacuum steps a new player with a massive amount of resources and a very specific plan, the United States, specifically the Reagan administration.
We have to talk about the Contra War. But the source material framing here is fascinating. It's not just the U.S.-funded rebels. It talks about total asymmetric warfare and psychological operations.
It's a crucial shift in the theory of warfare. The Reagan administration couldn't invade Nicaragua directly. The memory of Vietnam was too fresh. It wasn't politically viable, so they had to destroy the revolution from the inside out.
So the goal wasn't just to win battles.
No. The goal wasn't just to defeat the Sandinista army militarily. That was almost impossible given the popular support they had initially. The goal was to destroy the socio-political capacity of the enemy.
What does that mean in plain English? Socio-political capacity.
It means breaking the will of the people. It means making daily life so miserable, so terrifying, and so chaotic that the Nicaraguan people would eventually say, we don't care about the revolution anymore. We don't care about literacy campaigns or land reform. We just want this to stop.
Make the country ungovernable.
Exactly. And we know this was the strategy because we have the playbook. The CIA actually produced a manual in 1984, Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare, the Taya Khan Manual. This document it's chilling to read. It is a textbook on the engineering of chaos. It's not about fighting soldiers. It's about attacking the mind of the population.
I want to read a specific part of it because I think people need to hear the language. It talks about neutralization.
Neutralization, a very clinical, sterile, bureaucratic word.
But the manual explains that neutralization of government officials, judges, mayors, police chiefs, tax collectors, is a necessary tool. It says, and I'm quoting, It is possible to neutralize carefully selected and planned targets, such as court judges, MISTA judges, police, and state security officials.
Let's be absolutely clear what that means. It means assassination. It means going into a small town and murdering the mayor in front of his family.
Why? Why kill a small-town mayor?
Not because the mayor is a military threat, but because if you kill the mayor, you prove that the new Sandinista state cannot protect its own people. You create a vacuum of authority, you create fear, you make people think twice before collaborating with the government. It's a virus in the social software.
And it gets darker. There's a section on creating martyrs.
This is the implicit terror strategy. It's pure Psyops. The manual instructed the Contras to provoke violence at mass demonstrations. It literally suggests having your own people infiltrate a peaceful protest and have them start throwing rocks or firing weapons to get the police to overreact.
Wait, so they were manufacturing their own victims?
Yes. If you can create a riot and someone gets shot, maybe even one of your own people, you can then go on the radio and say, look at the brutal Sandinista regime killing innocent protesters. It's gaslighting on a national scale. It's weaponized confusion.
And it's all laid out in a manual.
Step by step. The sources also talk about the armed propaganda teams, the EPA. This sounded bizarrely sophisticated for a group we usually picture as just thugs in the jungle.
It was incredibly sophisticated.
Yeah.
These weren't just fighters, they were trained storytellers. The EPA teams would go into rural villages where the government's presence was weak.
And they wouldn't just show up with guns blazing?
No. They would spend days helping the peasants harvest their crops. They would fix fences. They would hold town meetings. They would act as the good cops. They would listen to people's problems.
Building trust. Earning legitimacy.
Exactly. The manual explains how to present their weapons not as tools of war, but as arms of the people, there to protect them. And then, once they had the trust of the village, they would use specific criminals, who were part of their network, for selective jobs, the violence, the assassinations. So the peasant is seeing two realities: the nice Contra who helped pick the beans and listen to his problems, and the mysterious violence that happens at night to the Sandinista teacher.
It creates cognitive dissonance. It shatters trust. Who is the protector? Who is the threat? The manual calls this implicit terror. You don't always have to be the one pulling the trigger if you can control the narrative of who pulled it. It's about owning the story.
And beyond the psychology, there was the physical destabilization, the really overt stuff, mining the ports.
1984, this was a CIA direct operation. They used speedboats operating from a mothership to lay mines in the harbors of Corinto and Porto Sandino.
Which is an act of war against a sovereign nation.
It is a clear violation of international law. The World Court later condemned the U.S. for it. It blew up Dutch ships, Panamanian ships, a Soviet tanker. It physically choked the economy. You can't export coffee or import medicine if ships are terrified to dock.
So you have the U.S. putting this massive, multi-layered pressure on the system. But, and the sources are very clear on this, the Sandinistas weren't just innocent victims in this process. They made huge, unforced errors. They helped destroy themselves. They had massive blind spots.
Huge blind spots. And the biggest, most tragic one was the Atlantic coast.
The ontological fracture. This part of the story is. It's just a catastrophe of misunderstanding.
It really is. To understand this, you have to understand the geography of Nicaragua. It's basically two different countries that were glued together by lines on a map.
Right.
The Pacific side, where Managua is Spanish, Catholic, mestizo. That's where the Sandinistas were from. That's where the centers of power have always been.
And the Atlantic side.
The Caribbean coast, it's huge, it's swampy, it's isolated. The people there are largely indigenous Miskito, Rama, Sumu, and Afro-descendant Creoles. They speak English or indigenous languages. They are mostly Protestant Moravians from a German missionary church. They have almost nothing culturally in common with the Spanish Pacific.
Okay, so the Sandinistas, these young Marxists from the Pacific, take power in Managua. They see the world through one lens: class struggle. Capitalists versus workers.
Right. That's their entire worldview, their ontology. And they look at the Miskito people on the coast, and they don't see an ancient culture with its own hierarchy, its own connection to the land, its own history. They see, well, the source says, they viewed them as anthropological reliquaries.
Relics.
Yeah.
Like something in a museum.
Exactly. Relics of a pre-capitalist past that needed to be modernized. The Sandinistas thought, we need to wake these people up. We need to integrate them into the modern revolutionary state.
I remember seeing a reference to a billboard in the notes.
Yeah.
Something the government put up. The Atlantic coast, A giant awakens.
Can you imagine the arrogance of that? A giant awakens. It implies they were asleep. It implies they were backward savage until the revolution arrived to save them. It's incredibly insulting.
This is the cultural deafness. They literally could not hear what the Miskito people were saying.
And the Miskitos didn't care about the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. They didn't care about the Cold War. They cared about one thing above all else: land, autonomy, their traditional territories. Their message was simple: leave us alone on our rivers.
So when the Miskitos started organizing and demanding autonomy,
The FSLN panicked. Their rigid Marxist dogma couldn't process it. It didn't fit the model. They thought, if you want to be separate from the revolutionary state, you must be a counter-revolutionary. They saw it as separatism, manipulated by the CIA.
which led to Red Christmas of 1982. This is a hard part of the history to read.
It's an absolute tragedy. The Sandinista army, trying to create a free fire zone along the Honduran border to cut off the Miskitos from the Contras, forcibly relocated 42 communities.
42 villages.
We're talking about 10,000 people. Soldiers came in, burned their houses to the ground, killed their livestock, and marched them 60 kilometers to resettlement camps they called Tazbapri, which means free land in Miskito, a truly Orwellian name.
They burned their villages to the ground.
To protect them. That was the official logic. But for a Miskito, whose entire identity is tied to that specific riverbank, to that specific burial ground of their ancestors, burning the village is the end of the world. It was a cultural genocide in many ways, a trauma that completely severed the coast from the revolution.
And talk about shooting yourself in the foot. The U.S. and the Contras must have been ecstatic.
They exploited it instantly. The CIA started funding Miskito rebel groups like Missoura and Missoura Sada. They turned a disastrous domestic policy failure into a massive military and propaganda asset for the Contra War.
The source uses a really interesting phrase here to describe the Miskito position: contradictory consciousness.
It's a term from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. It explains the weird, contradictory position the Miskitos found themselves in.
How so?
They were fighting against the Nicaraguan state, which was officially anti-imperialist. But the Miskitos themselves often felt an affinity for the imperial powers.
Why?
Because historically, the British pirates and the American fruit companies and the Moravian missionaries on the coast treated them better, or at least with more respect, than the Spanish-speaking Nicaraguans from the Pacific ever did.
So you have indigenous people siding with the CIA because the revolutionary Marxists are acting like colonizers.
Exactly. It's an ontological fracture. The Sandinistas had a map of the world in their head-class struggle that simply did not match the actual territory of the Atlantic coast. And they destroyed their own legitimacy because they refused to get a new map.
Okay, so we've got the CIA Psyops engineering chaos. We've got the cultural disaster on the coast adding fuel to the fire. Now we have to talk about how this whole war was paid for. Because by the mid-'80s, the U.S. Congress had actually said, stop.
Right. The Boland Amendment. After the CIA's mining of the harbors became public, Congress was furious. They explicitly forbade using government funds to overthrow the Sandinista government.
So if you're the Reagan administration, or specifically a small group in the National Security Council led by Oliver North, and you want to keep the war going, but you can't use tax dollars, where do you get the money?
You build a shadow network, an off-the-books enterprise. You enter the Dark Alliance.
We are talking about the drugs.
We are. And I want to be very careful here because this is often dismissed as a wild conspiracy theory. But the source material we have isn't Reddit threads. It's Oliver North's own notebooks, declassified. It's the Senate Subcommittee report from 1989, the Kerry Committee report.
So this is documented.
It is. The evidence shows that as early as 1985, key officials in the NSC knew that the Contras were being funded by drug money. They knew, and they looked the other way.
Who are the key players here? The source names a couple people.
You have to look at Norman Meneses and Danila Blandin. These guys were Nicaraguans living in California. The DEA had known about them since 1976. They were major cocaine traffickers. Norman Meneses was known as Rey de la Droga, the king of drugs.
And these guys, known drug lords, were funneling the Contras.
They were the financial pipeline for the FDN, the main Contra army based in Honduras. They were moving tons of cocaine into the U.S., specifically into south-central Los Angeles, which directly fueled the crack epidemic there and sending the profits back to the Contras.
And the U.S. government knew this.
The sources cite direct testimony. Pilots like Fabio Ernesto Carrasco. He testified to Congress that he flew planes from the U.S. down to airstrips in Honduras and Costa Rica. They would unload weapons for the Contras, illegal weapons, essentially, part of the Iran-Contra affair, and then load the same plane with cocaine for the return trip to the U.S.
Guns down, drugs up.
It was a perfect logistical loop. The same infrastructure that supplied the secret war also supplied the drug market and the U.S. authorities. Well, they looked the other way. There are documented cases where the Justice Department blocked DEA investigations into these networks because they were connected to the national security objective of funding the Contras.
That's the institutional entropy within the U.S. itself.
Right. It's not just that Nicaragua was falling apart. The U.S. legal and ethical system was decomposing. You had the CIA and the NSC deciding that their ideological goal-fighting communism in Central America was more important than the law, more important than the DEA's mission, more important than the health of their own citizens in Los Angeles.
It's terrifying when you think about it. The system eats its own rules to pursue a shadow objective.
That's what asymmetric warfare does. It's a poison. It corrupts the attacker as much as the defender.
So while the U.S. is rotting ethically to fund the war, Nicaragua is literally rotting economically because of the war. The numbers here they're hard to comprehend.
We call this the economics of dissipation. All the energy of the country is just being burned off, dissipated into nothing.
In 1988, the inflation rate in Nicaragua hit. Am I reading this right? It was over 33,000%.
Depending on the month and how you calculate it, estimates range from 10,000% to 33,000%. It's hyperinflation on a Weimar Republic scale. It means money is meaningless.
Describe what that looks like for a normal person. For you, the listener, imagine this.
It means you get paid in the morning, and your stack of bills might be a foot high, and you have to literally run to the market to buy rice, because by the afternoon, that same salary won't buy a single bag. It means people stopped using Cordobas, the currency, and started bartering. I'll trade you a chicken for a visit to the doctor. The formal economy just ceases to exist.
And the GDP per capita, the average wealth per person, dropped by half.
A 54% drop between 1978 and 1993. Think about that. The country became half as rich in a little over a decade. It wiped out 40 years of economic growth. It was a complete collapse.
Was this all the war? Or was it mismanagement by the Sandinistas?
It was a perfect storm. The war was the main driver. By 1986, it was consuming 50% of the national budget. You can't run a country, you can't build hospitals or schools when half your money is buying bullets and helicopters.
And the U.S. sanctions?
The embargo was strangling trade. But you also had the Sandinistas' own populist economics, which were, to be charitable, naive. They wanted to help the poor, which is a noble goal. But they did it by printing money to cover massive deficits. They subsidized everything. They ignored basic market signals. They prioritized distribution over production and macro stability. So they were trying to slice up the national pie more fairly, but the pie itself was shrinking every single day until it was just crumbs.
Now, the expert source draws a really interesting parallel here, a global symmetry. It compares Nicaragua to Mozambique, which on the surface seems random.
This is one of those light bulb moments in the research. When you zoom out, you see the pattern. If you look at Mozambique in the same period, 1977 to 1992, it looks exactly like Nicaragua, but on the other side of the world.
We have a newly independent Marxist government, Frelimo.
Check.
You have a brutal insurgency, Renamo.
Yeah, check. And Renamo was backed by hostile neighbors, first Rhodesia, then apartheid South Africa, just like the Contras were backed by Honduras and the U.S.
And the tactic?
Identical. They were a mirror image. The primary strategy was to target the infrastructure of the new state. Blow up the health clinics. Blow up the schools. Renamo was infamous for destroying the power grid. The Contras blew up grain silos and farmer cooperatives.
Why destroy a school? It has no military value.
To kill hope. It's a psychological target. If the revolution's promise is education for all and you blow up the school, you prove the revolution is a lie. You prove the state cannot deliver on its promises. You destroy the social contract.
The source calls these nations energy dissipators. That is such a dark, mechanical, and sort of perfect term.
It's a systemic view of the Cold War. The superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, weren't fighting each other directly in Europe. That would be nuclear suicide.
Right.
So they plugged into these small nations in the global south. The Soviets and their allies poured resources into Nicaragua and Mozambique. The U.S. and their allies poured resources into the Contras and Renamo.
So Nicaragua was just a battery, a circuit board.
A resistor in a global circuit. A place to burn off excess ideological and military energy. The superpowers ground each other down by burning up Nicaraguan lives, Nicaraguan bridges, and Nicaraguan coffee farms. It was a war of attrition, outsourced to the Third World.
That makes you feel incredibly small, like these countries were just NPCs in a global video game being played by Moscow and Washington.
It is a tragedy of scale.
But, and I want to shift gears here because it's not all just destruction, and the sources make a point of this. People have to eat, people have to survive. And in the middle of this collapse, the source material points out these little niches of resilience.
This is the agroecology movement. It's a fascinating story of bottom-up innovation.
I love this part because it shows how necessity breeds invention. The industrial food system that Somoza had built had completely collapsed. No tractors, no spare parts, no imported pesticides or fertilizers because of the embargo.
The Green Revolution model, which relies on a constant input of chemicals and machines, was dead, so the farmers had to pivot or starve.
Enter the campesino movement, farmer to farmer.
This wasn't just going back to the old ways. It wasn't about romanticizing the past. It was scientific experimentation at the village level. It was a horizontal exchange of knowledge, bypassing the government, bypassing the NGOs.
Give me a specific example. How does it work?
Okay, so a big problem was soil degradation and weeds. Instead of using chemical fertilizer and herbicides, which they couldn't get, farmers discovered and taught each other that if you plant velvet beans, a type of legume, alongside your corn.
Okay.
The beans do two things. One, they fix nitrogen in the soil, acting as a natural fertilizer for the corn. Two, they grow so thick and fast that they choke out the weeds, so you don't need herbicides.
So instead of buying a bag of fertilizer from a U.S. company,
You grow your fertilizer. It broke the technological lock-in. It was a form of resistance, a quiet agricultural resistance. It was farmers saying, if you block our ports, we will heal the soil ourselves.
and this wasn't just a few farmers, right? This became a real movement.
No. It grew from a survival mechanism in the 80s into a massive organized movement. It's why Nicaragua today has some of the strongest agroecology laws in the world. The law on agroecology and organic production passed in 2011. It's a direct legacy of that resilience.
That's a legacy that actually lasted. A spark of creation in all the destruction.
It is. It's a sliver of resilience in the entropy. A small system of order created out of the chaos.
So we moved to 1990, the end of the decade of fire. The war is still raging, the economy is gone, and the Sandinistas, under pressure from the international community, agreed to hold free and fair elections.
The shock. No one saw it coming.
The Sandinistas were sure they were going to win. They were the government. They controlled the media, the army, the state resources. All the polls said they would win. But Violeta Chamorro, the widow of a famous newspaper editor Somoza, had assassinated, leading a broad coalition of opposition parties, won.
And it wasn't even close. A landslide.
Why did they lose?
Yeah.
After all the propaganda, all the revolutionary fervor.
Because of everything we just talked about. The draft, first and foremost. The Servicio Militar Patriótico. Mothers were tired of sending their sons to die in the mountains for a war that never seemed to end.
The economy.
People were starving, they couldn't live on revolutionary slogans, and finally there was the grim realization that as long as the Sandinistas were in charge, the U.S. would never stop the war. The embargo would never end. The pain would never stop.
People voted for peace. They voted with their stomachs. They voted to stop the pain.
They voted against entropy. They chose a chance at stability over a revolutionary project that had brought them to ruin.
But, and here's the final, brutal twist of the knife, the story doesn't end in 1990. The FSLN lost power, but they didn't disappear. Daniel Ortega didn't disappear.
This is the mutation of the party
Yeah.
and the cycle of Caudillismo.
Caudillismo, the strongman culture that has plagued Latin America for centuries.
After the 1990 loss, the FSLN had an identity crisis. The real intellectuals, the poets, the writers, the people who believed in the democratic, pluralistic parts of the revolution, like Vice President Sergio Ramirez, like the legendary guerrilla commander Dora Maria Tellez, they started to criticize Ortega. They wanted to democratize the party. They wanted accountability.
Ortega.
He crushed them. He consolidated power. He argued that unity under his leadership was the only way for the party to survive. The intellectuals left or were pushed out. The party became less about the revolution and more about the power of Daniel Ortega.
And today, he eventually got reelected in 2006.
Today, the Ortega Murillo regime, Daniel and his wife Rosario Murillo, who is vice president, is in power. And former Sandinista allies, people who fought and bled for the revolution, now describe it as authoritarian, sectarian, and corrupt. They've jailed political opponents, including their old comrades like Dora Maria Tellez. They've shut down hundreds of NGOs.
It's a paradox. They still use the red and black flags. They still invoke the name of Sandino.
But the ideology has mutated into something unrecognizable. The source calls it a bizarre mix of Christian socialism and savage capitalism. They made a pact, El Pacto, with the old business elites they once fought against. They made deals with the conservative elements of the Catholic Church to ban abortion.
And the ultimate irony, the thing that closes the loop, the state has once again become a family property.
We are right back where we started, the state patrimony. The Ortega Murillo family controls the media, the oil distribution, the police, the courts. Their children run major sectors of the economy. It looks disturbingly similar to the Somoza dynasty they overthrew.
That is heavy. To fight for a decade, to lose 50,000 lives, to destroy the economy, only to end up with a different family running the same LLC.
It's the danger of vanguardism. It's a lesson that echoes through history. If you believe you are the enlightened vanguard, the only ones who know the truth, and you refuse to build democratic checks and balances and institutions that are stronger than individuals, you inevitably replicate the structures of power you fought against.
You become the dragon you set out to slay.
You become the dragon.
So when we step back and look at this entire complex ecosystem, at this entropic transition, what is the big takeaway from this deep dive?
The takeaway is that revolutions are not simple events. They are not clean stories. They are collisions of massive systems. The U.S. injected a colossal amount of chaos, algorithmic destabilization to break the system. The revolution consumed itself trying to control that chaos, and in doing so, created its own forms of chaos and repression.
And the tragedy.
The tragedy, as one source puts it, is how easily the tools of liberation were reconverted into tools of confinement. The mechanisms designed to free the people, the unified party, the powerful army, the centralized state, became the very mechanisms used to control them once again.
It really forces you to question the nature of power itself and how it corrupts any structure it inhabits.
It raises the most important question for any of us looking at history or politics, I think. And it's the thought we should leave our listeners with.
What's that?
If a revolution doesn't consciously and deliberately account for the complexity of the system it replaces, the deep culture, the economic realities, the psychology of power, the ghosts of its own history, is it destined to just replicate the very tyranny it fought against?
Can you kill the king without becoming the king?
That is the eternal, tragic question.
We're going to leave you with that to chew on. This has been a deep dive into the entropy of Nicaragua. Thanks for listening.
Keep questioning the narrative.
See you next time.